He was a poor single father who had almost nothing left. When he bought an old house full of junk, the neighbors laughed at him. But soon his son found something inside that changed their lives forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The wind carried the dust of a dying autumn across the empty road as Ethan Gray guided his rusted pickup along the narrow mountain path. The tires spat gravel, the headlights barely piercing the dusk. Beside him, 9-year-old Jake sat curled in his seat under a worn blanket, his small hands wrapped around a tin mug of lukewarm cocoa. The heater had stopped working months ago, but the boy didn't complain. He had inherited his father's silence, the kind born not of peace but of exhaustion. Ethan's eyes, once sharp and full of purpose, had grown hollow in the years since the factory shut down. His wife Emma had died the following winter, leaving behind nothing but a boy, a few boxes of tools, and debts that had long outlived her. Work had come and gone, odd jobs, short contracts, promises never kept. When he finally sold his last set of tools for gas money, he knew there was no turning back. A sign leaned crooked on the roadside, half buried in weeds. Property for sale, cheap. He remembered the phone call earlier that week, the man's indifferent voice on the other end. $30, cash only. It's an old wooden place near the foothills. Needs work, but it's yours if you want it. Ethan had laughed bitterly. $30 was all he had left. But the idea of walls that didn't move with the wind and a roof that might hold off the snow was enough to make him agree. A man with nothing left could still hope. They reached the property just before nightfall. The last streaks of sunset bled over the ridge, staining the sky in shades of rust and dying gold. The house stood alone at the edge of a clearing, half swallowed by wild grass and creeping vines. It was more skeleton than home, its porch sagging under the weight of years, the shutters hanging like broken wings. The chimney leaned slightly, and one of the windows gaped open, glass long gone. Still, to Ethan, it was shelter. He parked the truck near what might once have been a fence and stepped out into the cold. The air smelled of pine and rot, and somewhere far off, an owl called. Jake followed, his boots crunching the frost. "Is this it?" the boy asked quietly, his voice barely more than a breath. Ethan looked at him and managed a thin smile. "Yeah," he said. "This is it." They stood there a moment, father and son, framed by the fading light and the silence of forgotten land. Then Ethan picked up their small bundle of belongings, a blanket, 2 tin plates, and a lantern, and pushed open the door. The hinges groaned like something alive. Inside, the air was heavy with dust. The floorboards bowed beneath his boots, each step releasing a creak that echoed through the empty rooms. The house smelled of damp wood, old smoke, and time. A cold draft slid down the hallway, rattling the loose boards of the walls. Jake coughed, his breath a small cloud in the chill. Ethan set the lantern on a wooden table that leaned awkwardly against one wall. Its surface was scarred with knife marks and burns. "We'll clean it up," he said, though even he didn't sound convinced. In the main room, the fireplace stood black and hollow. Someone had left behind a pile of split logs, gray with age. Ethan knelt and struck a match. The first attempt fizzled, the second caught. The flame licked the edges of the bark, then grew, filling the room with an unsteady orange glow. Shadows danced across the walls, and for the first time in months, the place felt less like a grave. Jake sat close to the fire, rubbing his hands. "It's not so bad," he said with a hopeful grin. Ethan smiled faintly. He didn't have the heart to disagree. As the fire settled, he explored the rest of the house. 2 rooms upstairs, both small and nearly empty, just dust, old nails, and the faint smell of mold. One of them still had a narrow iron bed frame, bent but usable. He spread their blanket there. The roof leaked in one corner, dripping rhythmically into a tin bucket he placed beneath it. When he returned downstairs, he noticed a trap door at the back of the hallway, half hidden beneath a discarded rug. He tested it. The wood felt soft, damp. Beneath it, faintly visible in the lamplight, was the edge of a staircase leading down. The discovery unsettled him. He told himself every old house had a cellar storage for coal, canned goods, maybe tools, but something about the darkness below that door made his skin crawl. He covered it again and returned to the fire. Outside, the wind picked up, scraping branches against the roof. The sound reminded him of claws. Jake had already dozed off, his small body curled near the warmth. Ethan watched him for a long time, the boy's face soft in the firelight, and felt both pride and guilt twist inside him. He had promised Emma he would give their son a good life. Instead, here they were, sleeping in ruins bought with the last of their hope. When the fire began to fade, Ethan added another log. The flames flared and threw new shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to move even when the fire was still. He rubbed his eyes, blaming fatigue. The long drive had worn him down, and the cold had crept into his bones. But as he sat there, half dozing, a sound reached him, a dull, rhythmic thud, soft but distinct, rising from beneath the floor. He straightened, listening. For a moment there was only the wind. Then again 3 beats, like something heavy tapping wood from below. He glanced toward the trap door. The sound came from that direction. He told himself it was the old house settling, the wind, perhaps the echoes of his imagination. Yet it came again, more deliberate this time, and he felt the hairs on his arms rise. Ethan took the lantern and moved toward the hallway. The flame flickered as a gust of cold air slipped under the door. The trap door seemed to breathe with the draft, its corners lifting slightly as though something below shifted against it. He stood there a long time, unsure whether to open it or leave it be. Behind him, Jake stirred in his sleep, murmuring softly. That small sound pulled him back. He turned away from the door and returned to the fire, setting the lantern beside his son. He sat through the night, eyes open, every creak of the house amplified in his ears. When the first light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the shutters, he finally rose. The fire had gone out, leaving only ash and the smell of smoke. He stretched stiffly and looked toward the hallway. The rug over the trap door had shifted. A fine line of gray dust trailed out from beneath it, as if pushed upward from below. Ethan crouched, touching the dust with his fingers. It wasn't soil, it was fine, gritty, like powdered concrete or old cement. He stared at it, then at the door itself. The nails holding the hinges were new, gleaming faintly against the rotted wood. Someone had been down there not long ago. He stood and looked around the room, at the cracked walls and broken glass, at the empty corners that seemed to breathe when he wasn't looking directly at them. The house was silent now, but it was a heavy silence, the kind that waits. He glanced at Jake, still sleeping by the ashes of the fire, and felt a weight settle in his chest. Whatever this place was, whatever stories its walls had swallowed, it hadn't been abandoned, not completely. Outside, the wind had died, and the world was still. Ethan walked to the window and wiped a circle clear of grime with his sleeve. The clearing lay quiet under a pale gray sky. Yet something about it felt watched, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. He turned back to the trap door once more, its edges now marked by that strange gray powder, and knew that when night came again, he would have to see what was beneath. But for now, as the morning light grew stronger, he said nothing. He only stood there, hands on the windowsill, and whispered to himself, "We'll make it work. We have to." He didn't notice the faint vibration that ran through the floorboards beneath his feet, or the way a few specks of dust lifted into the air from the trapdoor's seams, like something stirring in the darkness below. The house, long silent, seemed to breathe again, and somewhere under the floor, that dull, slow thudding began once more, steady, patient, waiting. The morning came pale and soundless, a thin veil of mist drifting through the trees that surrounded the house. Ethan had slept only in fragments, his dreams haunted by faint echoes of that muffled sound rising from below. He had hoped that the light of day would erase it, that it would reveal itself as nothing more than an old house's sighs and shifting boards. But when he stepped into the hallway, he saw the same line of gray dust spilling from beneath the rug, and the same faint vibration that seemed to hum through the wooden floor. He waited until Jake finished his breakfast, a small piece of bread and an apple they had brought with them, before sending the boy outside to gather kindling. He didn't want him near that trap door, not yet. When Jake's footsteps faded beyond the porch, Ethan lifted the rug and knelt. The trapdoor's hinges were streaked with rust, but the nails looked too clean, the wood beneath them freshly split. Someone had tampered with it recently. He hesitated, listening again for any sound from below, then slid his fingers into the iron ring and pulled. The hinges screamed softly as the door lifted, revealing a narrow stairway that disappeared into darkness. The air that rose to meet him was cold and damp, smelling of old metal and wet earth. For a moment, Ethan almost let the door fall shut again, but something deeper, curiosity, defiance, or perhaps a stubborn need to understand the place he had bought, pushed him onward. He took the lantern from the table, struck a match, and descended. The wooden steps creaked beneath his boots. Each one seemed to groan louder than the last, and twice he had to catch his balance when a board gave slightly under his weight. At the bottom, the passage opened into a low-ceiling room. The stone walls glistened with moisture, and faint white mold crept across them like lace. Shelves lined two sides of the space, bowing under the weight of old jars, rusted tools, and wooden crates half collapsed from rot. The lantern's glow flickered across piles of forgotten things, cans, broken glass, a shovel without a handle, the frame of what might have been a cot. It was the sort of basement where years collected and were forgotten. Yet something about its order felt wrong. The things here had not been left by accident. Ethan began to clear a space, shifting boxes and dragging aside an old barrel. Underneath, half buried in dust and debris, his boot struck something metallic. He crouched and brushed away the dirt. It was a small iron chest, square and heavy, its lid secured by a corroded lock and a length of chain. The metal was mottled green and brown with age. But as he traced his hand along it, he could feel a faint vibration, as though something inside still held energy. The lock gave way under the hammering of a nearby pipe wrench, snapping open with a dull crack. Inside lay a collection of objects, wrapped in layers of waxed cloth that had kept them strangely preserved. A notebook with a cracked canvas cover, a folded map, a small metal fragment, roughly the size of a man's fist, gray and faintly luminescent, as if it caught light from no source at all. Ethan turned it over in his palm and felt a faint warmth radiating from it. The surface was etched with lines too precise to be scratches patterns, almost geometric, that shimmered like mercury when they caught the lantern's glow. He set it down quickly, uneasy. He opened the notebook next. The first page bore a name written in block letters, Edward Langdon. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate. Beneath the name, a date, April 1948. Ethan turned the pages carefully, the paper yellowed and fragile. Most of the entries were technical, dense with terms he didn't understand. Sample instability, containment breach, Sector 14B. One passage, however, stood out. Specimen reacts to low-frequency vibration. Unstable beyond safe limits. Federal directive demands immediate sealing of site. Project classified under mineral research to mass true purpose. He read the lines again, trying to make sense of them. The words felt heavy with secrets, the kind that never see daylight. He unfolded the map next. It showed the surrounding mountains marked with red ink and precise coordinates. One of the points was too close, less than 2 miles north of the house. Ethan's thoughts raced. Who was Langdon? What had he been doing here? The federal mention hinted at something larger, something buried deeper than just a cellar. He looked again at the metal shard resting in the chest. It pulsed faintly, a breath of light across its surface like an animal heartbeat. He covered it quickly with the cloth and replaced it inside the box. When he climbed back up, his hands trembled slightly. Jake was on the porch, feeding bits of bark into a tin bucket to start the fire. "You were down there a long time," the boy said, glancing up. "Was there anything?" Ethan forced a smile. "Just junk, some old tools. We can use them later." He ruffled Jake's hair, avoiding his eyes. He didn't want to lie, but he didn't dare tell the truth, not until he understood what he'd found. They spent the afternoon repairing a section of the roof, patching it with old boards from the barn out back. The snow clouds gathered thick and low, turning the air sharp with the smell of ice. By evening, the first flakes had begun to fall, drifting through the broken shutters like ash. The fire burned steady, casting its glow over the room. Jake sat cross-legged, reading a tattered book he'd found in one of their boxes, while Ethan sat by the window, staring into the whitened forest. Something about the stillness outside unsettled him. The world felt too quiet, as if holding its breath. Then, from the darkness beyond the tree line, a faint shimmer appeared, a pulse of light, quick and rhythmic, flashing 3 times, pausing, then again. At first he thought it was lightning, but the pattern repeated, deliberate, calculated. He leaned closer to the window, squinting. The flashes were distant, but perfectly aligned with the direction marked on Langdon's map. His stomach tightened. The coordinates. He drew the curtain quickly before Jake could notice. The boy looked up, puzzled. "What's wrong?" Ethan shook his head. "Nothing. Just tired." He tried to read, but the image of that pulsing light stayed behind his eyelids every time he blinked. When he finally rose to add more wood to the fire, something caught his attention. Across the room on the dusty windowpane, a faint outline had appeared. A handprint, small but not Jake's, too wide, too long in the fingers. It hadn't been there an hour ago. He stared at it, his breath shallow. The print looked recent, as though pressed from the outside, the glass faintly fogged around its edges. He stepped closer. The shape was reversed, the pressure marks facing inward. Whoever had left it had been inside. The lantern flickered. A floorboard creaked somewhere behind him. Ethan turned sharply, heart pounding. Nothing but the shadows of the fire shifted across the walls. He exhaled slowly, fighting the instinct to grab the rifle he'd left in the truck. He told himself it was condensation, that maybe Jake had touched the window earlier. But deep down, he knew better. That night, after Jake had fallen asleep by the fire, Ethan stayed awake, staring at the trap door from his chair. The wind hissed against the windows. The trees groaned under their snow. The sound beneath the floor didn't return, but every so often he thought he felt a tremor in the boards. A soft, almost imperceptible pulse, as if the house itself had a heartbeat. He sat there until the first pale light crept across the floorboards, a dull ache throbbing in his temples. When he finally rose to stretch, he noticed something odd. The window pane where the handprint had been was clean now, wiped clear. Not a trace of moisture remained. Outside, the snow lay unbroken. No footprints, no signs of life. Ethan turned slowly toward the hallway, where the trap door waited in silence. The air felt heavier than before, thick and charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. He had come to this place for refuge, but it was becoming clear that the house had its own will, its own history buried beneath its floors. He tried to tell himself that he could ignore it, that he could simply keep his head down, patch the roof, survive the winter. But in his heart, he knew he had already crossed the threshold of something he didn't understand. The notebook, the glowing fragment, the coordinates, they weren't coincidences. The past was stirring, and the house was its mouth. As the morning sun rose weakly through the mist, Ethan pressed his hand against the cold window pane where the print had been. The glass was smooth beneath his fingers. For a heartbeat, he thought he felt another touch from the other side light, deliberate, answering. He stepped back sharply, his breath catching. The fire popped behind him, a log collapsing into ember. Outside, the forest stood silent. Inside, the air hummed faintly, like a low whisper running through the walls. Ethan looked once more toward the trap door, then at his sleeping son. The world beyond this house might have forgotten whatever had happened here, but the earth beneath it had not. And as he stood there, frozen between fear and disbelief, something deep below gave a single, muffled thud, as though acknowledging his presence, or perhaps welcoming it. The day after the handprint vanished, the cold deepened, turning the air thin and metallic. Frost spread across the windows, and the world beyond the clearing disappeared into a curtain of white. Ethan spent the morning chopping wood and pretending to busy himself with repairs, though his mind never strayed far from what lay beneath the house. The notebook, the strange glowing fragment, the pulse of light in the forest, all of it pressed against him like invisible weight. He caught himself glancing at the trapdoor again and again, half expecting it to stir. Jake's laughter carried faintly through the snow outside as he built a crude fort from fallen branches. Ethan tried to smile, tried to let that small sound remind him why they had come here, to start over, to survive. But there was no peace in the silence that surrounded them. It felt too heavy, as though the mountains themselves were listening. By noon, he made a decision. He needed answers. Something real, Something grounded to cut through the growing unease. There had to be some record of Edward Langdon, some mention of the man whose work had filled that notebook with secrets. He told Jake to stay close to the house and keep the fire alive. Then he climbed into the truck and started down the narrow road that led to the town below. The engine coughed and shuddered, fighting the cold, but it carried him through the winding descent until the trees opened to reveal the small cluster of buildings that made up Cedar Falls. The town had been larger once. He could see it in the empty windows, the faded signs, the skeletal remains of an old rail spur rusting behind the grain mill. He parked near the library, a squat brick building that leaned slightly with age, and went inside. The air was warmer there, scented faintly with dust and oil from the ancient radiators. Behind the counter sat a thin, gray-haired man with spectacles that magnified his pale eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked without looking up from his papers. Ethan hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I'm looking for information about someone," he said finally. "A man named Edward Langdon. He lived around here sometime in the late 40s. The librarian froze. His pen stopped mid-stroke. Slowly he lifted his gaze. "Langdon," he repeated as if tasting the name. "You'd better be careful where you dig. Some things around here were meant to stay buried." Ethan frowned. "So you know him?" The old man's eyes shifted toward the far wall of the library, where a cabinet of old newspapers and town records stood. "He worked for the government," he said quietly. "They said it was geological research, testing mineral seams in the mountains. But the locals, my father among them, they said there were trucks at night, shipments guarded by men in uniforms without insignia. Then one winter, there was an explosion in the hills. No one ever saw Langdon again. The authorities sealed off the area, called it unstable ground. The next week, the mine closed. Cedar Falls never recovered." The librarian turned back to his papers as though that were the end of it. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He thanked the man, then moved to the cabinet and began searching through the old microfilm reels and folders. It didn't take long to find a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1949. "Local scientist missing after research accident. Federal agents close investigation." Beneath it, a grainy photograph showed a man in his 50s, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. The article was short, evasive, but one line near the end made Ethan's heart stutter. "Witnesses report strange lights over Sector 14B before authorities arrived on scene." Sector 14B, the same phrase that filled Langdon's notebook. Ethan copied the coordinates onto a scrap of paper and folded it into his pocket. When he stepped back outside, the snow had stopped. The light was harsh and colorless, reflecting off the frozen earth. As he started the truck, he caught movement in the side mirror. A black SUV parked across the street, engine idling, its windows tinted, too dark to see inside. He looked again, and it inched forward just enough to make its presence clear. The unease that had been simmering all morning sharpened into something colder. He turned the key, the truck's engine roaring to life, and pulled onto the main road. The SUV followed. At first he thought he might be imagining it. The vehicle kept its distance as they wound through the curves, never too close, never too far. When he slowed, it slowed. When he sped up, so did it. His pulse thudded in his ears. There was no traffic this far out, no reason for anyone to be following. He pressed harder on the gas, tires spitting slush. The SUV matched him turn for turn. It wasn't until he reached the narrow ridge road that he finally made his move, swerving suddenly into an old logging trail and cutting the lights. The truck jolted violently over roots and stones before settling behind a curtain of evergreens. He sat there in the silence, breath steaming in the cold air, listening. The SUV passed slowly along the main road, its engine a low growl fading into the distance. Only when the sound was gone did he allow himself to breathe again. He stayed hidden for several minutes more before returning to the house, every nerve still taut. By the time he arrived, dusk was falling. The windows glowed faintly from the fire Jake had kept burning. The boy ran to the door when he saw his father's headlights, relief brightening his face. "You were gone all day," he said. "I thought maybe you—" Ethan silenced him with a smile and a hand on the shoulder. "I'm here," he said. "Everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. He could still feel eyes on him, though the clearing was empty. Inside, the air was warm, almost comforting, but the comfort was fragile. Ethan lit the lantern and pulled Langdon's notebook from its hiding place beneath the floorboard. He opened it beside the fire and compared the coordinates he'd copied. They matched exactly with a point deep in the mountains north of the house. Whatever Langdon had discovered, it had been close enough that the man's last experiment might still lie buried there. Jake watched from across the room. "Are you going somewhere?" he asked. "Not tonight," Ethan said. "But soon. There's something up there I need to see." He tried to sound calm, though unease gnawed at him. He didn't mention the SUV or the librarian's warning. Some truths a child should never have to carry. That night, after Jake fell asleep, Ethan stayed by the fire reading through the notebook's final pages. The entries grew erratic, the handwriting jagged and uneven. Langdon had written of structural vibration responses, containment integrity compromised, and finally, they are coming to seal it. If they fail, the valley will not be safe. The last words trailed off mid-sentence, the ink smeared by a single dark line, as though the pen had been torn away mid-stroke. A faint noise pulled Ethan from the page. Outside, something moved. He went to the window, careful not to disturb the curtain. The clearing was dark except for the pale sheen of moonlight on snow. Then he saw them, two figures standing just beyond the tree line, motionless, their shapes little more than shadows against the white. One of them raised a hand, and a brief flash of red light pulsed a signal, quick and precise, aimed not at the house but toward the mountains beyond. Ethan's breath caught. He dropped the curtain and stepped back, his heart hammering. The notebook slipped from his grasp, landing open on the floor. The lantern's flame flickered in the draft, and for an instant the light fell across the page, illuminating words he hadn't noticed before, scrawled sideways in the margin, barely legible. "Not alone. They watch the watchers." He stared at the words until his vision blurred. When he finally looked up, the fire had burned low, casting only a faint glow across the room. The house creaked softly, the same slow rhythm he'd heard before, like breath drawn through wooden lungs. Ethan knelt and picked up the notebook, his hand trembling. Outside, an engine started. The sound was distant but unmistakable, the low, steady rumble of the black SUV returning. He crept to the window, careful to stay in shadow. The vehicle idled at the edge of the clearing, its headlights off, exhaust coiling in the freezing air. After a long minute, it rolled backward and disappeared into the forest road, leaving behind only the whisper of tires on snow. Ethan stood there listening until the silence returned. The fire crackled softly behind him, but the warmth no longer reached him. The truth had begun to surface, and with it came the realization that the house and everything around it were part of something larger, something planned. He turned toward the hallway and caught sight of the trapdoor once more, that square of shadow in the floor where the unknown waited. He didn't open it, not yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time. For now he could only stand in the dim light, listening to the slow settling of the boards and the faint echo of an engine vanishing into the dark. When he finally went to bed, he left the lantern burning beside him, though he doubted any light could keep what waited below from finding its way back to the surface. As he drifted toward an uneasy sleep, the wind rose again, carrying with it a low, distant rumble from deep within the mountains, a sound too heavy to be thunder, too long to be mere echo. It was a warning, or perhaps a summons, and beneath the floor, as the fire dwindled to embers, the earth gave a single hollow tremor, as if something buried there had just awakened. The following morning came without color. The world outside was drained of warmth. The snow hardened into brittle glass, beneath a sky the color of ash. Ethan woke early, the ache of sleeplessness dragging through his limbs. The fire had burned out, leaving only a gray mound of ash, and the cold pressed in from every direction. He rose quietly so as not to wake Jake and stepped to the window. The clearing lay untouched, the snow smooth and clean, but the unease that had settled in him the night before had only deepened. He could still hear the echo of the rumble that had rolled through the mountains while he slept, a low, deliberate vibration that seemed to have come from the very earth beneath the house. He dressed and went outside, his breath rising in plumes. The forest beyond the clearing was silent. The only movement came from a raven perched on a post, black against the snow. He looked toward the tree line where the figures had stood the night before, but there was nothing, no tracks, no sign that anyone had been there at all. and yet he knew what he had seen. He could not explain it away this time. By the time he came back inside, Jake was awake, sitting cross-legged by the cold fireplace. "Dad," he said softly, "there was someone outside last night, wasn't there?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe," he admitted, "but they're gone now. Probably just people passing through." The lie came easier than he expected. Jake studied him for a moment, then looked back at the dead fire, saying nothing more. They spent the morning in uneasy silence. Around midday, the crunch of tires broke the stillness outside. Ethan froze, his instincts sharpening. He went to the window just as a black SUV rolled into the clearing and came to a slow stop in front of the house. The same vehicle that had followed him from Cedar Falls. The doors opened and two men stepped out, both dressed in long dark coats that brushed the tops of their boots. They moved with a precision that didn't belong to travelers or lost hunters. One of them, tall and lean, carried a briefcase. The other kept his gloved hands in his pockets, but his eyes swept the house with clinical focus. Ethan opened the door before they could knock. "Can I help you?" he asked. The taller man smiled politely, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "We're from the geological department," he said smoothly. "Routine follow-up on property assessments. There have been reports of ground instability in this area." Ethan stared at him, his jaw tight. "There's nothing unstable here," he said. "The land's solid." The man nodded as if humoring him. "Still, we'd appreciate a look around, for safety's sake." The other man's gaze lingered on the doorframe, on the cracks in the wood, on the faint dusting of gray powder near the threshold. "How long have you been living here, Mr. Gray?" he asked. The use of his name hit Ethan like a cold nail. "A few days," he said carefully. "Bought the place cheap. Didn't know there was any kind of inspection needed." "Not inspection," the taller man corrected gently. "Just precaution. This region has a complicated history." His tone was calm, but something about the way he said the word complicated sent a tremor through Ethan's gut. Jake appeared in the doorway behind him, clutching his coat sleeve. The man's eyes flicked briefly toward the boy before he smiled again. "We won't take much of your time." Ethan stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind him, blocking their view of the inside. "Whatever you're looking for, you won't find it here," he said quietly. "The house is old, that's all. There's nothing underneath it but dirt." The man with the briefcase tilted his head, studying him. "Dirt," he repeated softly, as if testing the word. "Funny thing about dirt, Mr. Gray, it remembers what's buried in it." He glanced at his partner, who nodded almost imperceptibly, then turned back to Ethan. "If you notice anything unusual, vibrations, noises, anything at all, you should leave immediately. Some doors, once opened, are difficult to close again." The words hung in the air, heavier than the cold. Then without another glance, the men returned to their vehicle. As they climbed in, one of them took a final photograph of the house, the flash faint but deliberate. The SUV started, rolled back down the clearing, and disappeared into the woods. Ethan stood there long after they were gone. The snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes melting on his skin. He knew now that whatever he had uncovered in the cellar was not some forgotten relic. It was part of something larger, something that still had guardians. He looked toward the mountains, where the faint outline of the ridge loomed through the haze. The coordinates from Langdon's map burned in his memory. 2 miles north, Sector 14B. That night, as the wind rose, he made his choice. They couldn't stay ignorant. Whatever was buried out there had drawn those men, and it would draw them again. If he could find it first, maybe he could understand what danger they were trying to keep hidden. After Jake fell asleep, Ethan spread the map across the floor and traced the red markings by lantern light. The ink had faded, but the lines were clear enough to follow. At dawn, he packed a small bag with supplies, flashlight, rope, canteen, the folded map, and roused Jake. The boy rubbed sleep from his eyes. "Where are we going?" he asked. "To the mountains," Ethan said. "Just for a look." Jake hesitated, but there was a trust between them that words didn't need to touch. He nodded, bundled in his coat, and followed his father out into the frozen world. The hike was slow. The snow reached nearly to their knees in places, and the trees grew dense as they climbed higher. The silence deepened with every step until the only sounds were their breathing and the crunch of boots on ice. After an hour, they reached a rocky slope where the snow thinned. There, half buried beneath vines and debris, stood a rusted metal gate bolted into the hillside. A faded sign hung crookedly above it, its letters barely visible beneath the corrosion. Sector 14B, authorized personnel only. Ethan brushed the snow from the latch. The padlock was shattered, rusted through. He pulled the gate open, and a breath of cold air rushed out, carrying with it the faint stench of oil and metal. Inside, a narrow tunnel stretched into darkness, the walls lined with concrete and twisted cables. Their footsteps echoed as they stepped inside. The tunnel sloped downward, the air growing heavier with each turn. They passed rooms filled with broken machinery, rusted pipes, and shattered glass panels. Strange symbols were painted on the wall circles. Numbers, warnings half erased by time. Jake pointed to one of them, his voice barely a whisper. "What was this place?" Ethan didn't answer. He could see it now. The remnants of a laboratory, perhaps military, long abandoned, but not forgotten. The deeper they went, the stronger the smell became. Burnt metal and something acrid. Chemical. At the end of the tunnel stood a reinforced door, its surface warped and blackened as though scorched by fire. The latch hung loose. He pushed it open. Beyond lay a chamber the size of a barn, its floor littered with debris metal crates, broken cables, shards of glass. In the center of the room stood a row of cylindrical containers, half buried in dust. Each was stamped with a faded insignia, a triangle encircling the letters U.S. property. Ethan approached one, brushing the grime from its surface. The seal at the top was cracked. Inside, through a narrow fissure, a faint blue light pulsed like a heartbeat. He recoiled, the memory of Langdon's glowing fragment flashing through his mind. Before he could move, a noise echoed from the tunnel behind them, the low growl of an engine, distant but growing. Ethan grabbed Jake's hand. "We have to go," he whispered. They ran back through the corridor, their footsteps slapping against concrete. The light from the entrance flickered ahead, and through it, he saw movement shadows crossing the snow outside. When they reached the mouth of the tunnel, the black SUV was parked there, its headlights off, its windows dark. The same two men were climbing out. One raised a hand and called, "Mr. Gray, stop where you are." His voice was calm, but the tone carried command. The other man held something in his hand, a small device that blinked with red light, scanning the ground. "You were told to stay away from this site," the first man said. "You've seen things you shouldn't have." Ethan stood still, shielding Jake behind him. "What is this place?" he demanded. "What were you people doing here?" The taller man sighed. "It's not what matters anymore. What matters is that no one disturbs what's left. Do you have anything from the site? Any material?" Ethan's hand instinctively went to his coat pocket, where the folded map lay hidden. "No," he said. "Nothing." The man watched him for a long moment, then nodded to his partner. "Let them go." Ethan didn't wait for another word. He grabbed Jake's arm and started down the slope. Behind them, the SUV's engine roared to life. As they reached the bottom of the hill, a deep rumble shook the ground. Ethan turned in time to see the entrance collapse inward, the hillside swallowing the gate in a cloud of dust and snow. The explosion's echo rolled through the valley like thunder. They didn't stop running until the trees closed around them again. When they finally reached the clearing and the house came into view, both were breathless, their faces streaked with cold sweat. Jake looked up at his father, fear flickering behind his wide eyes. "Dad," he whispered, "they're going to come back." Ethan looked at the mountains, where the smoke from the collapse still rose like a wound against the sky. "I know," he said. "That's why we have to be ready." He glanced toward the house, the place that had started all of this, and felt the weight of the map against his chest. The answers hadn't been buried by accident. They'd been sealed, hidden behind warnings and lies. And now that he had uncovered them, those who wanted them lost would not rest until the truth was silenced again. That night, when the wind returned, it carried with it a new sound, distant, hollow, like the shifting of earth far below. The house trembled faintly, and the boards creaked as though something deep beneath it had moved in response. Ethan sat awake until morning, the map open in his hands, knowing that the past was no longer buried, and that by morning someone would come looking for what he refused to give back. The storm began before dawn. The wind came down from the mountains like a living thing, bending the trees and hurling snow against the windows in thick, angry gusts. Ethan sat by the fire, his shoulders hunched. The map of Sector 14B spread across the table before him. The ink had bled slightly from the damp, but the red lines were still visible lines that now led to nothing. A collapsed tunnel buried beneath tons of stone. He had gone to that place looking for answers, but the only thing he had found was fear. The men had been willing to destroy the entire site rather than let it be seen. That told him enough. Whatever had been buried there, whatever Edward Langdon had discovered, it had not been meant for the world to know. Jake slept upstairs, but his rest was uneasy. He had cried quietly the night before, though he tried to hide it, pretending to be brave for his father. Ethan wished he could tell him everything was fine, that the danger had passed, but it wasn't true. The house itself seemed to know it. Every beam and board groaned in the wind, as if echoing some deeper disturbance below. The sound came in steady waves, almost rhythmic like the heartbeat of the earth itself. He opened the notebook again, his fingers tracing the last smudged lines of Langdon's writing. There were fragments of sentences that made no sense. Technical jargon mingled with despair. Containment breached. Exposure beyond limit. Neutralized material at all cost. Then near the margin, in smaller script, if they fail, the valley will not be safe. Ethan's stomach tightened. He thought of the glowing mineral he had touched in the cellar, how it had seemed alive, pulsing faintly in his hand. If the same material was what Langdon had been experimenting with in those tunnels, then it wasn't just dangerous, it was volatile, and the collapse might not have destroyed it. It could still be there, deep underground, waiting. The wind struck the house again, a sharp bang against the shutters, and then something else. The low hum of an approaching engine. Ethan's breath caught. He crossed to the window, careful to stay in shadow, and peered through the crack in the curtain. Headlights cut through the snow, moving slowly up the path. The black SUV, they were back. He turned off the lantern and climbed the stairs two at a time. Jake stirred when he touched his shoulder. "Dad?" "Quiet," Ethan whispered. "Get your boots. We need to go." The boy obeyed without question, his small hands fumbling with the laces. Within moments, they were moving down the back steps and into the trees, their figures swallowed by the darkness. From the edge of the clearing, Ethan watched as the SUV pulled to a stop in front of the house. Two men got out, different faces this time. Younger, but dressed the same, their movements precise and wordless. One carried a metal case, the other a rifle slung casually at his side. They entered the house without knocking. Through the window, Ethan saw the flash of their lights sweeping across the walls, then settling on the table where the notebook had been. He had left it open. He cursed under his breath. The taller of the two men picked it up, leafing through the pages before slipping it into the case. Then he spoke into a small radio clipped to his collar. Ethan couldn't hear the words, but he saw the other man nod and move toward the back of the house, toward the cellar door. The urge to run was strong, but another instinct, a harder, older one, rooted him in place. He couldn't leave them to destroy everything. If they found the map or what he had hidden, they would erase every trace of it. And if the material beneath the house was truly unstable, they might trigger something far worse. He turned to Jake. "Stay here," he whispered. "Whatever happens, don't come back until I find you." The boy's eyes widened, but before he could protest, Ethan pressed the folded map into his coat pocket. "Keep this safe. No one can ever have it." Then he rose and slipped through the trees back toward the clearing. The door to the cellar stood open when he reached the house. The two men were below, their voices echoing faintly through the floorboards. He moved quietly, the snow masking his steps, and entered through the side door. The air inside was colder than outside, as though the fire had never burned there at all. He crouched near the hallway, listening. "Radiation levels are climbing," one of the men said from below. "We shouldn't be down here without gear." "We're not here to study," the other replied. "Orders are to neutralize. Seal it if possible, destroy if not." Ethan's heart hammered. Neutralize. He knew what that meant. They were going to bury whatever was down there, perhaps with explosives, as they had done in the mountains. The house would not survive it, and neither would anyone nearby. He took the rifle from the rack by the door, a hunting piece he had cleaned but never fired since moving in, and stepped toward the cellar stairs. The men were bent over the spot where he had found the iron chest days before. Their equipment hummed faintly, casting pale blue light across the walls. The taller one turned suddenly, catching sight of Ethan's silhouette. "Stop right there," he ordered, reaching for his weapon. But Ethan had already raised the rifle. The sound of the shot filled the cellar, deafening in its closeness. The man fell backward, his flashlight skidding across the floor. The other reached for the metal case, but Ethan fired again, the bullet shattering the concrete beside him. He fled up the stairs, shouting into his radio as he ran. Ethan slammed the trapdoor shut and threw the bolt across it, chest heaving. He didn't know if the man below was dead or alive. He didn't want to know. He only knew that they wouldn't stop now. He ran outside, the wind tearing at his coat. Jake was gone. Thank God. He was gone. The snow was deeper now, erasing tracks almost as soon as they were made. He could barely see the trees through the white blur, but he forced himself toward the ridge, toward the path they had taken earlier. Behind him, the SUV's engine roared to life. He reached the edge of the clearing just as the explosion tore through the house. The blast lifted him off his feet, throwing him into the snow. For a long time he couldn't move. The roar was replaced by a deep, ringing silence. When he finally opened his eyes, he saw what remained of the house, a burning skeleton framed against the storm. Its roof collapsed inward, fire licking through the broken timbers. The heat from it reached him, even through the cold. He lay there, numb, watching as the flames devoured everything. The last traces of Langdon's secret turning to ash. He thought for a moment that he saw figures moving through the smoke, men in heavy coats, carrying cases. But then the fire flared brighter, and they were gone. He found Jake hours later, huddled beneath the old pine near the frozen creek. The boy was shivering but alive. When he saw his father, he ran to him, burying his face against his chest. Ethan held him tightly, whispering words that were lost in the wind. They stayed there until the fire's glow faded behind the ridge, replaced by the pale light of dawn. In the weeks that followed, the world forgot. The newspapers called it a gas explosion in an abandoned property. No names were mentioned, no investigation followed. Cedar Falls went on as it always had, small and half asleep, its people content to let the past stay buried. But the truth lingered in the valley, carried in the silence of the mountains and in the memories of two people who had seen too much. Years passed. Jake grew into a man, his father's face surviving only in photographs and in the lines he saw in his own reflection. He became an engineer, drawn by the same restless curiosity that had once driven Ethan. And one spring morning, long after the world had moved on, he returned to the valley. The clearing was unrecognizable now, overgrown with grass and wildflowers. The foundation of the house remained, a rectangle of cracked stone half buried in moss. He knelt beside it, brushing away the soil, and his hand struck something hard. Beneath the hearthstone lay a small iron box, sealed and rusted but still intact. He pried it open carefully. Inside were the brittle remains of Edward Langdon's notebook, a folded map, and a single letter addressed in his father's handwriting. Jake unfolded it slowly. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. "If you are reading this, it means they didn't find everything. What's buried here is more than gold or knowledge. It's a warning. Keep it hidden, and remember, truth isn't always for the living." He read the letter twice, then placed it back inside the box. The wind stirred through the trees, gentle now, almost kind. He closed the lid, returned the box to its resting place, and covered it with earth. Some things, he understood, were better left in silence. As he stood to leave, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time that day, spilling light across the ruins. For a moment it seemed to him that the ground beneath the old foundation glowed faintly, a soft blue shimmer that pulsed once, then vanished. He watched it, neither afraid nor surprised, then turned away. By the time he reached the road, the valley was quiet again. The wind had stilled, and the mountains stood unmoving in their shroud of mist. Whatever had been buried there, whatever his father had died to protect, would sleep undisturbed. And though the world would never know his name, Jake Gray carried the truth forward in silence, a legacy written not in records or fame, but in the unspoken courage of a man who had chosen to save others by letting himself disappear. Above the empty clearing, the last smoke from the past curled upward and dissolved into the light, leaving behind only the whisper of the wind and the memory of a wooden house that once stood against the snow. If this story kept you watching, hit subscribe. There's more coming. Don't miss the next twist and share this video so others can discover it too.